What if the first cities we call the beginning were not the beginning at all, but a return, not an invention, but a repair? Imagine a room that feels too quiet even when you breathe. A museum gallery at closing time. The lights are dim to protect what is old. The air is controlled. The glass is thick. And behind that glass, the past sits like a patient animal that has learned not to move. A small object, barely larger than your palm. Clay, baked hard. Edges chipped. Surface crowded with marks that look like tiny shadows, short strokes pressed into wet earth thousands of years ago, then fired, then buried, then lifted again into daylight. Those marks are not decoration. They are not art in the gentle sense. They are function. They are memory made physical. And there is a strange feeling that comes when you stare at them long enough. Not wonder, not pride, unease. Because when you expect the earliest writing to look like a first attempt, messy, experimental, and sure, these marks do not behave that way. They do not hesitate. They do not search. They declare. Before we go deeper, settle in. If you like stories that calm your mind while they quietly disturb your certainty, you can like the video and subscribe. And if you're still listening, leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. I want to imagine this narration traveling through different rooms, different nights, different cities, one voice crossing thousands of kilometers the way these old texts cross thousands of years. Now let's return to the clay. Because the question isn't simply what does it say? The question is, why does it sound like it remembers something we don't? In the modern world, we treat history as a ladder. Step by step, stone to bronze, village to town, picture to letter, myth to science. We like that line. We find comfort in it. It means our present is earned. It means the past is simple. But every so often, archaeology does something that doesn't feel like a ladder. It feels like a fracture. You dig down, expecting rough beginnings, and you hit a floor that looks planned. You expect the first cities to stumble into shape, and you find grids. You expect early records to be crude and narrow, and you find mathematics. Not just counting. Not just one. Too many, but systems, conversions, ratios, tables. You find time sliced into units that still live inside your phone clock. You find circles divided into the angles your maps still use. You find the same silent pattern repeated. Precision arriving too early. The land where this question grows sharp is the southern part of ancient Mesopotamia, where rivers braid through flat earth, where the horizon can dissolve in heat, where the soil itself is clay, and where water is both life and threat. If you stand on that plain in late summer, the air shimmers. The distance becomes unreliable. And it's easy to understand why people who lived there became obsessed with boundaries, measurements, and record-keeping, because the land itself blurs. But what they built in that blurred land did not blur. They built edges. They built corners. They built straight lines. At some sites, the earliest layers of true urban life appear, as if a switch has been flipped. There is settlement. Yes, humans always lived and moved and worked the land, but then something changes. Suddenly you have organized districts. You have standardized bricks. You have administrative seals. You have storehouses and workshops and temples laid out with intention. Not the look of improvisation, the look of a plan. And alongside the plan, writing. Not just pictures of sheep. Not just tokens. Not just scratches. But a script that already knows it will be used for contracts, for taxes, for inheritance, for law, for the movement of goods, for ritual, for astronomy, for instruction. A script that behaves like a tool that has already been sharpened. This is where the mind starts reaching for explanations. Maybe the earlier stages existed but didn't survive. Maybe the practice was on wood or leather. Maybe the learning curve was erased by time. All possible, but the pattern keeps returning. Not once. Not twice, again and again. And then you find something else. You find the way these people spoke about themselves. Not as inventors, not as the first, but as restorers. This is not a modern interpretation. It's embedded in the way their kings describe building, the way they talk about temples, the way they frame law, the way they explain knowledge. Not, I made this new, but I returned it. Not, we discovered this, but it was given. Not, we began, but we came after. And once you hear that tone, you can't unhear it. There's a kind of humility in it, yet also a kind of quiet arrogance. Because to say we restored what existed before is to say something else existed at a scale worth restoring. So what was it? Here the clay begins to whisper about water. Not the gentle water of irrigation canals. Not the seasonal water that feeds barley. But the water that interrupts. Across Mesopotamian texts, across later retellings, across different languages and empires, the same idea appears. There was a boundary in time, a before and an after that people treated as absolute. The story isn't always told as global. In the ground, it rarely is. The layers vary. Some cities show thick deposits of sterile silt. Others show less. Some show scars. Some show nothing obvious. But the memory behaves as if everything ended. This is one of the strange things about human civilizations. An event can be geographically limited and still be emotionally total. A flood might not cover the entire planet, but it can cover an entire world, the world that matters to the people who lived inside it. And when that happens, the trauma does something. It compresses time. It turns a disaster into an era. It becomes the hinge around which everything else swings. We can see how this works even now. A war, a collapse, a mass migration, people date their lives from it. Before that year, after that year. Before the fire, after the fire. Imagine that feeling but stretched across generations. Imagine a society whose grandparents still carry the story in their bones, whose temples are built like vows, whose writing feels less like convenience and more like insurance. Because the oldest writing in Mesopotamia is not just accounting, it's an obsession with not losing track. The choice of medium tells you everything. Clay is abundant there, but abundance alone doesn't explain devotion. Clay is heavy. It breaks. It's not easy to transport. It's not glamorous. And yet they press their memory into it anyway, over and over, day after day. Why? Because clay survives what other media do not. It survives dampness. It survives time. It survives burial. And when it's fired, it becomes stubborn. If you are a people who fear water, you choose the medium that can come back from water. That's not poetry. That's strategy. Now think about this slowly. What kind of society treats writing not primarily as communication, but as a hedge against destruction? A society that has already seen something disappear. And this is where the story shifts from ancient wonder into something quieter and sharper. Because once you accept that the earliest cities might be repairs and the earliest writing might be preservation, you are forced into a question that feels almost rude. Preservation of what? It's easy to assume. Food counts, taxes, trade. But the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. There are tablets that assume mathematics is already a shared language. There are tables that look like classroom materials for students, meaning the knowledge they practice has already been established, formalized, and institutionalized. There are astronomical records that imply long observation. Not one season, not two. Decades. Generations. To track certain cycles with confidence, you need continuity. You need someone to care enough to watch the sky repeatedly and record what they see, then pass that habit to the next watcher. And here is the paradox. If a catastrophic interruption happened, how did the continuity survive? The answer might be simple. Survivors carried it. But that simple answer has consequences. It suggests that after the interruption, the people who rebuilt did not rebuild empty-handed. They rebuilt with templates. Templates of measurement. Templates of timekeeping. Templates of layout, templates of ritual, and templates behave differently than inventions. When you invent, you experiment. You try variants. You abandon what doesn't work. Your early stages look messy. When you follow a template, your early stages look confident but sometimes smaller. Because you know what the ideal is, but you don't have the full resources to replicate it. You can see this in human history repeatedly. After the collapse of a large empire, later societies rebuild infrastructure with reduced means. Roads become narrower. Public buildings become simpler. Coinage becomes less consistent. Literacy contracts. Then, later, instability returns. Complexity grows again. Now imagine that pattern in the deep past. Imagine a world where a catastrophe forces people to reduce not only population, not only wealth, but ambition. And then they rebuild competent, organized, but restrained. In some ancient sites, you can feel the difference between a confident first act and a careful second act. The scale shifts. The tone shifts. The architecture repeats alignment and plan, but the grandeur seems held back, as if the builders are following a remembered blueprint rather than inventing a new one. This is why certain temples are rebuilt on the same foundations again and again, maintaining orientation across centuries like a stubborn promise. It's not just practical, it's symbolic. It's saying, the pattern remains. And when a culture's central behavior is restore the pattern, you have to ask what it fears. It fears drift. It fears forgetting. It fears being the last generation that remembers how the world is supposed to be. This fear can create a particular kind of civilization. Meticulous, bureaucratic, ritual-heavy, obsessed with order, terrified of chaos. Mesopotamia becomes, in many ways, the civilization of boundaries. Laws, contracts, property, seals, signatures, measurements, calendars. Because when you live after an interruption, you learn that civilization is not guaranteed. It has to be maintained like a fire. And yet there is another layer to the unease. It's not just that these people were organized. It's that their memory reaches backward into a time they barely describe. In certain lists and chronicles, time before the interruption is not narrated like normal history. It's named. It's counted. But it's not filled with stories. As if the details were lost, but the structure remained. Name, place, length. Name, place, length. And sometimes the lengths are impossible. When ancient texts claim reigns that last vast spans far beyond a human lifetime, modern minds instinctively reach for symbolism. It must mean dynasties, not individuals. It must mean cycles, not years. It must be exaggeration. Those interpretations may even be correct. But there is a deeper question that doesn't depend on whether the numbers are literal. Why did they feel the need to draw such a stark line? Why insist that before was longer and after was shorter? Because that pattern appears far beyond Mesopotamia. Many ancient traditions, separated by geography and theology, carry a similar structure. A long-lived earlier age, then a catastrophe, then reduced lifespans. It's as if humanity remembers, in mythic form, a shrinking. Not necessarily a biological shrinking, a world shrinking, a possibility shrinking. A world where something was closer, gods, spirits, forces, whatever language a culture uses for the unknown, and then after the threshold, that closeness retreats. In Mesopotamian stories, the divine often feels physically present in the earlier age. Then, after the boundary event, the divine becomes mediated, distant, accessed through rituals rather than conversation. This is not something you can prove the way you prove a carbon date, but you can trace the emotional geometry of it. Before, direct. After, indirect. Before, abundant. After, regulated. Before, porous boundaries between realms. After, walls. And this shift is mirrored in law and architecture. Spaces become more restricted. Sanctuaries become more layered. Access becomes controlled. It's as if the culture is building its own distance into stone. Now, at this point, it's tempting to fall into fantasy aliens, lost super-civilizations, cosmic intervention. The internet loves those roots because they feel like answers. But the more unsettling possibility is simpler. That the ancient world experienced, because in a sense, they did. Imagine survivors watching a river plain recover. The water recedes. Mud becomes ground again. The old foundations are still there, but cracked. The old canals filled with silt. The fields ruined. The storage jars empty. They begin again. But they begin with a memory of how it used to work. And if you have that memory, you become desperate to preserve it. You teach it to your children. You write it on clay. You build temples to keep the pattern stable. You invent bureaucracy not as coldness, but as survival. This could explain a lot. It explains why early records look confident. They aren't the first attempt, they're the preserved method. It explains why myths are threaded through technical documentation. Because in that worldview, knowledge and ritual are not separate. Both are part of the same survival system. It explains why the flood becomes a boundary in time even if the flood was regional. Because it wasn't just water. It was a break in transmission. And transmission is civilization. Now let's step aside from the rivers for a moment and listen to another kind of evidence. Language. One of the strangest features of summer is that the language we call Sumerian doesn't neatly sit inside known language families the way you expect. It behaves like a lonely island. That doesn't mean it arrived from space. Languages can be isolates for many reasons: extinction of relatives, demographic shifts, later dominance by other tongues. But it does deepen the mystery of sudden appearance. When a language arrives in the written record already complex, with vocabulary for specialized practices, it suggests either a long prehistory or a concentrated tradition that wasn't preserved in the materials we've found. Either way, the written record is only the tip of something larger. And this is crucial. The written record is not the invention of thought. It's the fossil of thought. It captures a moment when a culture decided that memory needed a body. So the question becomes, what pressure makes a culture give memory a body? Fear of loss. You can see it in the careful duplication of texts, the labeling, the archiving, the school exercises, the standardization. Standardization is what you do when you know that if each person keeps knowledge in their own style, it will mutate and fracture. Standardization is an anti-entropy weapon. And in Mesopotamia, you see a civilization building anti-entropy systems everywhere. In writing, in weights, in measures, in calendars, in law. This is not how a culture behaves when it feels safe in its own continuity. It is how a culture behaves when it is haunted by discontinuity. And then there is the story structure itself. Flood narratives are everywhere in the world. That's true. Water disasters happen. People remember. Stories form. But what is interesting is not the existence of flood myths. It's the recurring shape. Warning: a chosen survivor. A vessel. Animals or seeds of life preserved. A landing. A sacrifice. A new order. A promise or limitation imposed afterward. Different cultures paint it differently, but the skeleton repeats. Why would a flood story focus so obsessively on preservation rather than escape? If all that happened was the river overflowed, the story would often center on hills, on running, on refuge, on loss. Some flood stories do, but the arc structure is different. It is engineering. It is planning. It is carrying a sample of the world through the interruption. That is a profoundly administrative fantasy. It is the fantasy of a civilization that sees itself as a system that can be transported. A seed bank, a library, a record. And when Mesopotamian stories describe the building of a vessel with exact dimensions, coated with bitumen, stocked deliberately, what you're hearing is not just myth. You're hearing the imagination of survival expressed in the language of logistics. Because these are people who thought in inventories. Now, does that mean such a vessel existed exactly as described? Not necessarily, but it tells you what they believed mattered. What mattered was not only living. What mattered was carrying the pattern across the break. So now we return to the beginning question and let it breathe. What if the oldest cities we found weren't built by humanity's first architects, but by humanity's first restorers? If that's true, then civilization is not a single ignition. It is a cycle of ignition, collapse, reassembly. And that is deeply uncomfortable for the modern mind, because it suggests that progress is not a straight arrow. It is a fragile tradition, and tradition can break. Now picture the plane again, flat, vulnerable, where water can turn into an ocean overnight. In such a place, to rebuild is to accept you might have to rebuild again. So you anchor yourself to something that doesn't move. The sky. It's not an accident that early Mesopotamia is obsessed with celestial order. The sky is reliable. Rivers are not. Stars return. Seasons return. Planet cycles repeat. If you want stability, you look up. A calendar becomes not just a farming tool, but a psychological anchor. It says, the world has a rhythm even when the earth beneath you betrays you. And so the survivors become sky watchers. They become timekeepers. They become measurers. They carve permanence out of repetition. This is why, even in later empires that inherit Mesopotamian traditions, you see the same reverence. The idea that law and time and kingship are not invented by humans but received as order from above. It's the mythic way of saying, we didn't make this. We are caretakers of it. Caretakers. That word is everything, because caretakers behave differently than creators. Creators chase novelty. Caretakers preserve what works. In a caretaker civilization, innovation exists, yes, but it is framed as restoration. Even when something new is built, it is described as returning to a proper pattern. That framing isn't propaganda alone. It's identity. It's trauma management. It says, we survived by holding onto the template. We will continue by holding onto the template. And once you see civilization as trauma management, the whole ancient world looks different. Temples become not just religious buildings, but memory machines. Rituals become rehearsals of survival. Law becomes a fence against chaos. Writing becomes a container for the pattern. The beginning of civilization, in this light, is not optimism. It is caution. Now, there is another layer we have to talk about quietly, carefully, because it's easy to sensationalize. The claim that early astronomy is too precise is often exaggerated online. It's important to stay grounded. Ancient observers could achieve impressive precision with long observation and careful recording. You don't need telescopes to be excellent at pattern tracking. But you do need time. You need continuity. You need institutional memory. And that is the real point. Whether the numbers are off by a little or a lot, the existence of the system implies a stable tradition. So again we return. How does a stable tradition sit beside an interruption? It sits beside it if the interruption didn't erase everyone. If a subset survived and carried forward the critical methods. If scribal training became the backbone of continuity. And this is where the picture becomes haunting in a very human way. Because imagine being one of those survivors. You might not have an empire. You might not have armies. You might not have great monuments. But you have something else. A set of methods. You know how to measure a field. You know how to predict seasons. You know how to plan canals. You know how to organize labor. You know how to store grain. You know how to keep time. If you have those methods, you can rebuild. And if you know that catastrophe can erase those methods if they live only in your head, you do the most radical thing. You put them into matter. That's what writing is. Writing is the transformation of a thought into an object. An object can outlive you. It can survive your death. It can survive your city's fall. It can survive being buried. So you press the thought into clay. And you do it again and again until your civilization becomes not just people living together, but a library of techniques held in earth. This is one of the strangest and most beautiful things humans have ever done. We made memory portable across time. But the fact that it was done so early and with such urgency suggests that the fear of losing memory was already present, which means the shadow of loss preceded the beginning. Now, let's step into a different room, still in a museum, but not the same glass case. In another case, you see a cylinder seal, small, stone, carved with a seam. You roll it in clay, and it leaves an imprint like a signature. Seals are security. They are proof. They are identity in a world without paper. The moment you see seals, you know you are looking at a society that is worried about trust. Who owns what? Who promised what? Who owes what? Who has authority? These questions arise in any complex society. But in a society built after interruption, trust is even more fragile. Because the old order is gone, everything has to be reasserted. So seals appear, contracts appear, courts appear, law appears. Not because people became suddenly advanced, because people became suddenly aware that without structure, they could collapse again. And collapse is not theoretical to them. Now, imagine the emotional atmosphere of such a culture. Not constant panic, humans adapt, but a low, constant awareness. The rivers can rise. The harvest can fail. The city can be abandoned. The gods can withdraw. The world can narrow. So you build walls. You build archives. You build rituals that enact renewal again and again. The new year is not merely celebration. It's a restart, a symbolic clearing of chaos. You tell the story of how order returns after water. You tell it every year. You live inside it. Because repeating a story is how a society keeps trauma from dissolving into meaninglessness. It's how it shapes fear into identity. And the identity becomes, we are the ones who rebuild. Now, if you're listening late at night, if your mind is drifting, there's a quiet thought you might feel moving underneath all this. If our oldest written civilizations behave like rebuilders, then perhaps the true beginning is behind a curtain we can't lift. And that curtain may not be a conspiracy. It may simply be time. Organic materials decay. Coastal settlements drown. Rivers shift. Whole landscapes change. The earlier pages may not be hidden. They may be gone. So we stand at the edge of the earliest surviving record and feel the same thing those scribes felt. The fragility of memory. And we ask the same question in modern language. What happened before? Now, here is the part that keeps viewers listening, because it isn't just mystery. It's personal, because the story isn't only about ancient summer. It's about us. We still rebuild. We still inherit systems we didn't design. We still live in time divisions made by people we'll never meet. We still rely on calendars, laws, grids, standards. We live inside templates. And we assume the templates are permanent. But if the deep past teaches anything, it's that templates survive only when someone chooses to carry them. Civilization is not just invention. It is maintenance. And maintenance is quieter than invention. It doesn't make legends. It makes continuity. So perhaps the true heroes of the ancient world were not the kings whose names survive on lists, but the unnamed scribes who copied the lists, the teachers who drilled students on tables, the surveyors who kept angles consistent, the canal workers who preserved the grid, the archivists who buried jars of tablets under floors so floodwater would pass above them. Anonymous people preserving the pattern. That is a different kind of greatness. Now, if you want to keep the tone of a sleep story gentle, slow, but still gripping, there is a technique that works extremely well. You keep the listener inside sensory scenes, and you let the ideas arrive like tidewater rather than like lectures. So let's do that again. Picture the ancient city at dawn. Not the monumental version in textbooks, but the real one. Mud brick walls cooling after night. Canals reflecting pale light. Smoke from cooking fires thin and steady. A worker carrying reeds. A child running with bare feet, dust rising. And somewhere inside the temple complex, a scribe sits at a low table. He has a slab of clay, still soft. He has a stylus, reed cut at an angle. He knows exactly how hard to press to make a wedge that will be readable after firing. He writes not because he loves writing. He writes because writing is a duty. He records a delivery, a ration, a legal dispute, a temple offering. But he also copies a story older than him. A story of water, a story of the boundary, a story of how order returns. He copies it carefully because he believes the story is not entertainment. It is a warning. And that is the secret heart of this genre. History for sleep is not only calming, it is an echo of the old human habit of telling stories at night to survive the next day. Now imagine that same scribe years later, older, hands slower. He teaches a student. He corrects a sign. He demands precision. Because precision is not aesthetic, it is survival. In a world where a misread number can ruin a harvest plan, precision keeps people alive. The student groans, frustrated. The teacher does not soften, because the teacher remembers something the student does not. The memory of rupture. Even if he didn't live through it, it lives in the culture. It lives in the stories. It lives in the obsession. And when the student finally learns, he becomes another link in the chain. That chain is civilization. And when the chain breaks, everything becomes local again, temporary again, fragile again. This is why, in so many ancient texts, the flood is not merely destruction. It is the symbol of chain break. The world forgets. Now, we might ask, did a single flood create all these myths worldwide? We should be careful. The world is complex. Floods happen everywhere. Myths converge. Structures can repeat because human fears repeat. But we can still allow ourselves one speculation softly, without claiming certainty. What if the reason the flood narrative skeleton repeats is because it encodes a human logic that becomes inevitable after any large disruption? Warning: someone sees it coming. Vessel: someone builds preservation. Sample: someone carries the essentials. Restart: the survivors build again. It's not about whether one event happened globally. It's about how humans respond to collapse. And collapse is older than writing. So maybe the flood myths are the world's oldest instruction manual. How to be a species that can begin again. If that's true, then the most haunting line in any ancient story is not the waters rose. It's what comes after. Because what comes after is always smaller. The stories say, limits were imposed. Lifespan shortened. Fertility constrained. Death became fixed. Again, we don't have to take this literally to feel its meaning. After catastrophe, life feels shorter. After catastrophe, the world feels narrower. After catastrophe, the divine whatever you call it feels further away. That's trauma. And trauma becomes mythology. Now, if you want viewers to stay to the end, you must do one more thing. You must promise a final quiet payoff and ending that makes them feel something, not just understand something. So we build toward the silence. Because in so many of these texts, beneath numbers, beneath lists, beneath hymns, there is the same undertone. The past is bigger than we can reach. And the further back you go, the more the past turns into a blank space. Not because nothing happened, because memory cannot go there. We are looking at the edge of human recall. Think about that. We have satellites. We have servers. We have databases. We have photos of our lives. We think we are safe from forgetting, and yet we still lose things. Files corrupt. Formats change. Libraries burn. Wars happen. Floods happen. So the fear that drove those early scribes is not alien. It is ours. We are still writing so it will not be forgotten. We just do it with electricity instead of clay. But electricity is fragile too. A power outage can erase a night. A collapse can erase a century. Clay lasts. So the question becomes almost intimate. If a civilization as meticulous as early Mesopotamia feared forgetting, what did they already know about how easy it is to lose everything? Now, to keep this story original and gripping, we don't end by claiming there was definitely a lost super civilization. We end by leaving the listener at the threshold where the evidence ends and the imagination begins. Because that is the honest shape of the mystery. So here is the closing movement. Imagine once more the museum gallery. You walk past the cases. The lights are low. There is no sound except your own steps and the soft hum of climate control. And behind glass, the clay tablets lie like small doors sealed shut. You realize something slowly. These are not just messages from the past. They are defenses against the future. They were made by people who believed the world could break again. People who believed memory could drown. People who believed that if the pattern is not held in matter, it can disappear from minds. We call them ancient, as if that means primitive. But what if ancient simply means closest to the last time humanity had to begin again? What if the earliest cities are not the moment we learned to build, but the moment we learned to rebuild? What if the earliest writing is not the first time humans tried to speak across time, but the first time humans tried to survive across time? If that is true, then the real beginning of civilization is not a spark. It is an aftertaste. A civilization does not start when it learns to make bricks. It starts when it learns that bricks can be lost. A civilization does not start when it invents law. It starts when it knows chaos has already won once. A civilization does not start when it writes. It starts when it fears forgetting more than it fears labor. And so the clay sits in its glass case, silent, enduring, not telling us how humanity began, but reminding us quietly, stubbornly, that humanity has ended before in smaller ways, that worlds can contract, that time can be divided by catastrophe, and that the only thing that crosses the water reliably is what you choose to carry. If you listen closely, that might be the oldest message of all. Not we were the first, but we came after. We remembered what we could. We pressed it into clay, and we left it here so when the world narrows again, someone somewhere will still know how to begin. And now, as you drift towards sleep, hold that thought gently. Perhaps history is not a straight line, but a series of recoveries. Perhaps civilization is not progress, but persistence. And perhaps the deepest mystery beneath the oldest cities is not who built them, but what the builders were trying so hard not to lose. There is a moment, late at night, when the mind stops resisting questions and simply lets them float. It is the hour when certainty loosens its grip. This is the hour when stories like this do their quiet work. Because the deeper we go, the less this feels like ancient history, and the more it feels like a mirror. We tell ourselves that modern humanity is different, that we have surpassed fragility, that our systems are too distributed, too digital, too advanced to collapse in the way ancient ones did. But collapse rarely announces itself as total. It arrives as interruption, as delay, as silence where continuity once lived. The Sumerians understood interruption. They did not describe their world as eternal. They described it as conditional. In their myths, order is never guaranteed. It must be renewed. Chaos is not defeated once. It is pushed back repeatedly, ritually, administratively. Every year, every reign, every rebuilding. That tells us something important. A civilization that believes the world is stable builds monuments to itself. A civilization that believes the world is fragile builds systems. Mesopotamia built systems. And systems are not beautiful in the heroic sense. They are repetitive. They are exacting. They are dull to the impatient. But they are what survive. Look again at the way these people recorded time. Not simply seasons, not simply years, but cycles within cycles. Lunar months adjusted to solar drift. Intercalary corrections. Tables to reconcile discrepancy. Discrepancy was the enemy. When you fear collapse, you fear drift. Because drift is how systems fail quietly. A calendar that slips by a few days each year eventually destroys agriculture. A measurement that varies between cities eventually destroys trade. A law applied inconsistently eventually destroys trust. So you standardize. And standardization is a response to fear. This is why so many of the earliest Mesopotamian achievements feel oddly modern. Not because they were advanced, but because they were obsessed with compatibility. Everyone using the same units. Everyone speaking the same administrative language. Everyone aligned. Alignment is how survivors behave. Now let the thought widen. If the earliest cities we recognize are already operating in recovery mode, then human history may not be a single arc of ascent, but a waveform. Rise, stabilize, collapse, preserve, rebuild. Each time, something is lost. Each time, something survives. And what survives is rarely the most beautiful thing. It is the most useful. This may explain why ancient myths preserve technical memory inside symbolic language. The story of gods and floods carries instructions disguised as narrative. How to build, what to save, what matters. Because when literacy is rare, myth is the storage format. Now imagine a time before writing, before clay tablets, before seals, when knowledge existed only in people. In that world, catastrophe is not just physical, it is epistemic. When people die, knowledge dies with them. Skills vanish. Systems evaporate. The invention or reinvention of writing changes that permanently. Writing is humanity's first attempt at immortality. Not personal immortality, civilizational immortality. And this reframes everything. Writing was not created to tell stories. Stories were used to justify writing. The real function of writing was to make the world survivable beyond individual lives. This is why so many early texts are procedural. Lists, tables, instructions, records. They look boring to modernize because they were not meant to entertain. They were meant to persist. When a scribe copied a tablet, he was not expressing himself. He was maintaining the pattern. And patterns are what endure catastrophe. Now let's step even further back past tablets, past cities, past kings. Consider the moment when humans first realized that memory could outlive flesh. That moment changes everything. From that point on, the species no longer depends entirely on biological continuity. Culture can leap generations. Knowledge can wait. And if the Sumerians stand at the first clear edge of that realization, then they are not the first civilization in the naive sense. They are the first archivists of civilization. Archivists do not invent worlds. They curate remains. This makes their quiet insistence that they came after even more significant. Because archivists know the difference between origin and recovery. Now notice something subtle. The Sumerians did not spend their energy describing the pre-flood world in detail. They did not write long epics about its cities, its technologies, its daily life. Instead, they reduced it to structure. Names, numbers, boundaries. That is exactly what memory does under pressure. It sheds texture and keeps scaffolding. Trauma does not preserve richness. It preserves outlines. This is why survivors remember before as larger, longer, brighter, but cannot describe it clearly. The emotional truth remains even as detail dissolves. This is also why later cultures, inheriting fragments of these stories, fill the gaps with imagination. Gods, giants, demigods, golden ages. Myth grows where memory thins. So when modern audiences ask, were the pre-flood kings literal? They may be asking the wrong question. The more important question is, why did the Sumerians insist on a before that was categorically different from the after? Because that insistence shapes everything else. It tells us they did not see themselves as the first successful experiment. They saw themselves as what remained. And that is a profoundly human self-image. Now consider how this mindset echoes forward. Later Mesopotamian empires, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, inherit this worldview. Even as they conquer, expand, innovate, they frame their authority as restoration. Kings do not say, "I created order." They say, "I returned order." Even Hammurabi, whose law code we treat as foundational, does not claim authorship. He claims reception. The laws are shown to him, given, handed down. Why insist on that fiction? Because in a culture shaped by collapse, legitimacy comes from continuity, not novelty. To be new is dangerous. To be aligned with the ancient pattern is safe. And so power dresses itself as memory. Now pause here and feel the quiet implication. If civilization is an act of remembering after loss, then our modern obsession with innovation, constant novelty, constant disruption is historically unusual. Most of human history has not trusted new. It has trusted what survived last time. That instinct may feel conservative, even fearful, but it is also deeply rational when the cost of forgetting is extinction. This is why the oldest civilizations did not celebrate change. They ritualized stability, and rituals are memory loops. Every year, the same story. Every year, the same reenactment. Every year, chaos is symbolically defeated again. Not because chaos truly returns each year, but because the memory of chaos never leaves. The flood is never gone. It is stored in ritual time. Now let's take one more step into the uncomfortable. If the Sumerians were survivors of a collapse they barely understood, and if their systems shaped the civilizations that followed, then modern civilization may still be operating inside post-collapse architecture. Our laws, our calendars, our units, our cities, all inherited, refined, expanded, but not fundamentally reimagined. We often assume we are the peak. That assumption itself may be the most dangerous thing we carry, because every civilization that collapses believes it has escaped collapse. The Sumerians did not believe that. That is the difference. They believed collapse had already happened, and so they behaved accordingly. Now imagine what it would feel like to live with that belief quietly embedded in everything you do. Not panic, not despair, just caution. A slow, persistent awareness that the world is not guaranteed. This awareness produces a particular kind of calm. Not the calm of safety, the calm of acceptance. And that may be why their texts feel strangely soothing even when they speak of catastrophe. They are written by people who have already crossed the boundary and are now focused on continuity. History for sleep works best when it taps into that same calm. Not fear of the unknown, acceptance of fragility. Now let's widen one last time. Beyond Mesopotamia, every culture that emerges after a collapse inherits more than tools. It inherits anxiety patterns. Some cultures inherit the anxiety of scarcity. Some inherit the anxiety of invasion. Some inherit the anxiety of divine absence. Mesopotamia inherited the anxiety of interruption. And interruption changes how a species thinks. You begin to value redundancy. You value record keeping. You value tradition. And eventually, you encode these values into myths that outlast their original context. This is why flood stories do not disappear. They transform. They migrate. They adapt. Because the emotional core remains relevant as long as humans remain vulnerable to loss. Now, consider this carefully. If future archaeologists were to study our civilization after a major collapse, what would they see? Fragments of servers, hard drives, satellites fallen from orbit, cities rebuilt on older cities. They might find precise mathematics, advanced astronomy, complex laws, and they might wonder how it all appeared so suddenly. They might speculate about inheritance. They might suspect a before. In that sense, we are not so different from the Sumerians. We too may be living in the aftermath of forgotten collapses, local, regional, or global, that shaped our instincts without leaving clear records. History is not just what happened. It is what was remembered well enough to be written. Everything else dissolves into silence. And silence does not mean absence. It means inaccessibility. This brings us back to the quietest, most unsettling idea of all. That beneath our oldest records, there is not emptiness but erasure. Not deliberate erasure. Natural erasure. Water. Time. Decay. And the people who lived closest to that erasure understood it better than we do. They wrote not to celebrate themselves, but to protect the pattern. They pressed wedges into clay because clay does not care who you are. It cares only about pressure and fire. Clay remembers. So as you listen to this and your thoughts begin to soften, let the final idea settle gently rather than loudly. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the first cities was not that they built civilization, but that they refused to let it vanish again. Perhaps history does not begin with confidence, but with humility. And perhaps the reason these stories hold us so quietly, so steadily, is because somewhere beneath our modern certainty, we still recognize ourselves as rebuilders. Still living after something. Still carrying templates we did not design. Still measuring time using a system older than our names. Still walking on foundations we did not lay. And if that is true, then the silence beneath the first stone is not empty. It is full of everything we no longer know. And that, more than any myth or monument, is what makes the past feel so deep that it pulls us towards sleep. There is a subtle shift that happens after survival. Not immediately, not in the first generation, but quietly, across time. When a civilization rebuilds after catastrophe, the first priority is continuity. Food, shelter, order, memory. The second priority, however, is explanation. And explanation is where myth deepens. The Sumerians rebuilt their cities, restored their temples, and re-established kingship. But as generations passed, something changed in the way they spoke about the world. The language of restoration slowly blended with the language of distance. The gods were still present, but they were no longer near. In the earliest layers of memory, divine beings walk among cities. They speak directly. They decide openly. Kings do not rule for the gods, they rule as extensions of them. Authority is not symbolic. It is immediate. But after the flood, authority becomes mediated. Kings begin to rule by signs, dreams, omens. Priests interpret the will of the gods rather than receiving it directly. Ritual replaces conversation. Distance replaces proximity. This transition is subtle, but it is everywhere. Temples grow taller, but more restricted. Access narrows. Inner sanctums multiply. The divine becomes something you approach carefully rather than something that simply exists alongside you. The architecture tells the story even when the texts do not. And architecture never lies easily. If we read the rebuilt cities not as progress, but as adaptation, a different picture emerges. The post-flood world is not weaker, but it is constrained. Humanity has learned limits, not because it chose them, but because they were imposed. Time itself feels different. Before the flood, time in the king list stretches outward, vast and almost indifferent. After the flood, time contracts. Reigns shorten. Lifespans shrink. History becomes dense, crowded, urgent. This is what happens when a world becomes fragile. When survival is no longer assumed, every year matters. Every harvest matters. Every decision matters. The rhythm of life accelerates. And with acceleration comes anxiety. The Sumerians respond to this anxiety not with chaos, but with regulation. Law codes appear. Penalties are specified. Boundaries are enforced. The world is divided into what is permitted and what is forbidden. This is not moral evolution. It is psychological stabilization. When the universe feels unpredictable, humans impose predictability wherever they can. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Lipit Ishtar, later, the Code of Hammurabi, all present themselves as restorations of divine order, not innovations. The king does not claim wisdom. He claims obedience. Because wisdom, in this worldview, already existed and was lost. This loss becomes the quiet background of everything. Even art changes. Early imagery emphasizes cosmic scenes. Gods, heavens, primordial waters. Later imagery emphasizes control. Seated kings, boundary stones, lost stelae. The focus shifts from origin to management. From creation to maintenance. From wonder to responsibility. This is not decline. It is adaptation to a narrower world. And yet, something persists beneath the surface. Knowledge continues to circulate that feels older than the structures that contain it. Mathematical systems that assume prior mastery. Astronomical tables that presuppose long observation. Medical texts that categorize symptoms with unnerving confidence. These are not the products of a culture still experimenting. They are the products of a culture preserving something inherited. Which raises a difficult question. If knowledge survived the flood, who carried it? Not gods, not kings, but specialists, scribes, surveyors, astronomers, builders, people whose names are almost never recorded. This is one of the great illusions of history, that kings create civilizations. In reality, kings depend on invisible systems maintained by invisible people. And in a post-catastrophe world, those people become the true spine of continuity. Scribal schools emerge not as luxury institutions, but as survival engines. To be a scribe is not merely to write, it is to hold the pattern. Students memorize tables not because they are elegant, but because they are necessary. Mistakes are not aesthetic failures, they are threats. A miscalculated field boundary leads to conflict. A misread calendar leads to famine. A misinterpreted omen leads to fear. So precision becomes sacred, and precision carries memory forward even when stories fragment. This may explain why certain technical systems remain astonishingly stable across centuries. Base of 60 mathematics does not evolve because it does not need to. It works. It survives. It is remembered. Innovation exists, but it is conservative. Additions are layered carefully atop what already holds. The flood taught them that not everything returns. Now, consider how this worldview would shape a society's relationship with the future. A people who believe the past was greater do not imagine the future as utopia. They imagine it as responsibility. Their goal is not to surpass what came before, but to keep it from disappearing again. This is why so much Mesopotamian ritual is repetitive. Repetition is not boredom. Repetition is defense. Every year the same festival. Every year the same myth reenacted. Every year the king humbles himself before the gods, symbolically stripped of power, then restored. Why humiliate the king? Because unchecked power is dangerous in a fragile world. Because collapse teaches humility. And humility becomes ritualized. Even the king must remember he is not absolute. This is the psychological aftershock of catastrophe, a deep suspicion of permanence. Now shift perspective again. If the Sumerians believed they lived after a rupture, they were not alone. Many ancient cultures describe time not as linear progress, but as ages separated by destruction. Golden Age, collapse. Silver Age, collapse again. Cycles. These stories may not preserve literal events, but they preserve a shared intuition. That civilization is not a straight climb. It is a balance that can tip. And when it tips, what matters is what you saved. This is why memory itself becomes sacred. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as structure. When ancient texts say, "This was written so it shall not be forgotten," they are not speaking poetically. They are stating purpose. To forget is to die again. The flood does not need to return physically for civilization to end. Forgetting is enough. And perhaps that is the deepest reason these stories still resonate. Because even now, surrounded by data and archives, we sense how fragile memory is. Formats change. Media decay. Knowledge becomes inaccessible. We are not immune, which means we are still living in a post-flood psychology. Not necessarily a flood of water, a flood of loss. Now imagine this thought drifting with you as you rest. That the ancient world was not naive. It was cautious. That the first cities were not celebrating their beginning. They were mourning something they could not fully describe. That the calm tone of their records is not indifference. It is acceptance. And acceptance brings a quiet strength. The strength to rebuild without illusion. The strength to preserve without arrogance. The strength to carry forward what works, even if its origin is forgotten. This is why the Sumerians do not scream their mystery. They whisper it. They do not tell us what existed before. They only tell us that it mattered. And that may be enough. Because the moment you accept that human history may contain deep erasures, your relationship to the present changes. You stop assuming permanence. You stop assuming superiority. You begin to value continuity. And that is the true inheritance they left us. Not gods. Not kings. Not monuments, but the understanding that civilization is fragile and that survival depends not on greatness, but on remembrance. As your thoughts slow, let the final image settle. A clay tablet, pressed by human hands 5,000 years ago. Not to impress, not to dominate, but to endure. Still here, still readable, still holding a pattern, waiting quietly for the next generation that needs to remember how to begin again. After rebuilding comes normalization. And normalization is the most deceptive phase of all. When enough time passes after a catastrophe, the memory of danger softens. Not disappears, softens. It becomes a background hum rather than a sharp edge. Children are born who never saw the waters rise. They grow up walking streets that look permanent. Walls feel solid. Temples feel eternal. This is the moment when a civilization believes it has recovered. The Sumerians sensed this moment, and they resisted it. Their texts do something unusual. Instead of allowing memory to fade naturally, they embed reminders into structure itself. They do not let the flood become distant legend. They place it at the center of chronology. They carve it into king lists. They align it with reigns. They use it as a hinge in time. Before the flood, after the flood, everything is organized around that line. This is not how cultures behave when they want to forget. This is how cultures behave when they fear forgetting too much. Because forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting creates repetition, and repetition is the real enemy. The Sumerians understood something that modern societies often struggle to accept. Catastrophe does not require malice. It does not require punishment. It does not require meaning. It requires only alignment of conditions. Water rises. Systems fail. Knowledge fragments. The flood myths are not explanations. They are warnings. And warnings are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered. Now consider how this awareness shapes everyday life. When you believe collapse is possible, you do not romanticize chaos. You regulate. You codify. You formalize relationships between people, land, and time. This is why contracts appear so early. Why boundaries are measured so carefully. Why ownership is defined with precision, not greed. Fear. Fear that ambiguity becomes conflict. Fear that conflict becomes breakdown. Fear that breakdown becomes another ending. The post-flood world is not free. It is structured, and structure brings both safety and constraint. The Sumerians lived in a world where the divine was still present, but no longer intimate. The gods were powerful, but distant. Accessible through ritual, not conversation. This distance reshapes human responsibility. If the gods are near, humans obey. If the gods withdraw, humans manage. Management replaces trust. This is the psychological shift that marks true civilization. Not faith in stability, but competence under uncertainty. This competence produces impressive results. Cities flourish again. Trade expands. Writing spreads. Knowledge deepens. But beneath the success lies a quiet tension. Because success feels temporary, and temporary success creates a specific kind of seriousness. Sumerian art rarely indulges in excess joy. Even celebrations feel formal, processional, measured. There is beauty, but it is restrained. This restraint is not aesthetic choice alone. It is worldview. A world that has ended once does not easily believe in endless ascent. Now pause here and let the pace slow further. Imagine a Sumerian night. The city sleeps. Oil lamps flicker low. Canals reflect stars. A watchman walks the wall. A scribe sleeps near tablets he copied earlier that day. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, everything that matters is already in place. The quiet is not emptiness. It is maintenance. This is the most misunderstood aspect of ancient civilization. How much of it was designed for quiet continuity rather than spectacle? We remember monuments. They lived in systems. And systems are invisible when they work. Now shift perspective once more to the land itself. Mesopotamia is unforgiving terrain. Flat, exposed, dependent on rivers that do not behave predictably. Unlike Egypt, whose river floods gently and regularly, Mesopotamian floods are violent and erratic. This matters because environment shapes memory. In a predictable landscape, you trust cycles. In an unpredictable one, you trust preparation. The Sumerians did not believe the flood was impossible. They believed it was inevitable, if not literally, then structurally. So they prepared culturally. They embedded caution into myth. They embedded order into law. They embedded memory into clay. And they embedded humility into kingship. The king, despite divine sanction, is always at risk of losing favor. Signs and omens must be read constantly. Ritual purity must be maintained. Failure is not abstract. It is immediate. This creates a leadership culture obsessed with signs. Not superstition, but monitoring. When systems are fragile, leaders watch for deviation. This explains the rise of divination, not as magic, but as early risk assessment. The liver of a sacrificial animal becomes a map of potential futures. Not because the liver causes events, but because humans crave indicators. In a world shaped by catastrophe, uncertainty is the default state. So you look for patterns wherever you can find them. The sky, the organs, The dreams, the stars, astronomy, and divination grow together because both are attempts to read order in uncertainty. Now notice how this affects time perception. In a stable world, time stretches forward optimistically. In a fragile world, time compresses into cycles. You don't think about distant futures. You think about repeating seasons. You ask, will the canals hold this year? Will the harvest come? Will the city remain? This focus on near-term continuity gives Sumerian culture its distinctive calm seriousness. Not despair, not joy, equilibrium. This equilibrium is what allows the civilization to persist for millennia despite invasions, droughts, political collapse. Empires rise and fall. The system endures. Because the system was built by people who did not believe permanence was guaranteed. Now bring this insight gently forward. Modern societies often assume that stability is the default and crisis is the exception. Ancient Mesopotamia assumed the opposite. Stability was an achievement. Crisis was a memory. And when crisis is remembered clearly, arrogance does not thrive. This is why the Sumerians did not claim to be the first humans. They did not claim to be the first to think. They did not claim to have invented civilization from nothing. They claimed inheritance. Inheritance implies responsibility. You are not free to discard what you inherited. You are expected to preserve it. And preservation is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It is slow. It is quiet. This is why these stories work so well for sleep. They do not excite the nervous system. They settle it. They speak from a worldview that accepts fragility rather than resisting it. And acceptance allows rest. Now let the final idea of this part settle. What if the true achievement of early civilization was not technological sophistication, but psychological adaptation? The adaptation to live knowing the world can end. To build anyway. To teach anyway. To remember anyway. The flood, whether literal or symbolic, becomes the origin point not of despair, but of maturity. A species that has seen collapse does not waste energy on illusions. It builds quietly. It records carefully. It sleeps lightly. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath the oldest stones. Not that humanity rose once from nothing, but that humanity learned very early that survival is not about being first. It is about being careful enough to continue. And with that thought, the world of the Sumerians becomes less alien and more familiar. Because in many ways, we are still living inside the same question they faced. How do you preserve what matters in a world that can change without warning? Their answer was clay, ritual, repetition, memory. Our answer may look different, but the fear underneath is the same. And the calm they cultivated, the calm of people who have already lost and chosen to continue, still has something to teach us as the mind drifts toward rest.